October 12, 1943, Seoul, Korea. 17-year-old Park Rae-Sun walked through the narrow streets of her neighborhood, clutching a worn newspaper advertisement that promised factory work in Japan. The paper spoke of good wages, comfortable housing, and the opportunity to support the war effort through honest labor. Her family's rice shop had struggled since the Japanese occupation intensified, and the promise of steady income seemed like salvation. Across the Yellow Sea in Nanjing, China, 18-year-old Li Wei swept the floors of her family's small restaurant while listening to her parents argue about mounting debts. When a well-dressed Japanese official approached their establishment offering positions in textile factories, her father's desperate eyes met hers with unspoken understanding. The man's credentials appeared legitimate, his promises convincing. In Manila, Philippines, 16-year-old Maria Santos helped her mother tend to their small garden behind their bamboo house. The war had brought shortages and uncertainty, but when recruiters spoke of nursing positions that would help wounded soldiers while providing good pay, Maria's deeply religious mother saw it as God's calling for her daughter to serve. The three young women, separated by geography but united by circumstance, made decisions that would forever alter their lives. Rae-Sun convinced her parents that factory work would help feed her younger siblings. Li Wei saw an opportunity to save her family's restaurant. Maria believed she could serve both God and country while earning money for her struggling household. The journeys began separately but followed similar patterns. Rae-Sun boarded a crowded train with other young women, all carrying small bundles of belongings and hearts full of hope. The initial excitement of travel gradually gave way to unease as armed guards appeared, and questions about their destination received vague responses. Li Wei found herself on a cargo ship with dozens of other Chinese women, the cramped conditions below deck a stark contrast to the comfortable accommodations they had been promised. The guards spoke little, their expressions stern and unforgiving. Maria's truck convoy wound through the Philippine countryside for days, stopping only for brief meals and rest periods. The other women in her group whispered prayers and shared stories of the families they hoped to support with their earnings. When the three women finally arrived at their respective destinations, the brutal reality shattered every promise that had been made. Instead of factories, offices, or hospitals, they found themselves at military installations surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The buildings were stark, utilitarian structures that spoke of confinement rather than employment. A Japanese officer addressed each group of newly arrived women through interpreters, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. They were now property of the Imperial Army, he explained matter-of-factly. Their duty was to serve the soldiers, and any resistance would be met with severe consequences. The women who had traveled so far with hope now faced a nightmare beyond their worst imaginings. The first night brought terror that would haunt them for years to come. Rae-Sun was dragged into a small room where a soldier waited, his intentions clear despite the language barrier. Her protests and tears meant nothing to him. Li Wei's attempts to resist were met with brutal force that left her bruised and broken. Maria's prayers were silenced by violence that contradicted everything she had been taught about human decency. Days blurred into weeks, as the women were subjected to a rigid system designed to break their spirits and eliminate their identities. Each morning began with roll call, where they stood in lines while guards checked their numbers. Rae-Sun had become number 23, Li Wei was number 45, and Maria answered to number 67. Their names, like their former lives, had been stripped away. Medical inspections followed the morning roll calls, conducted by military doctors who showed no regard for dignity or privacy. The examinations were invasive and humiliating, performed under the watchful eyes of guards who treated the women as livestock rather than human beings. Any signs of illness or resistance were noted and punished accordingly. The afternoons brought an endless stream of soldiers, each woman expected to service multiple men daily, with little time for rest or recovery. The comfort stations operated with military efficiency, maximizing the number of soldiers served while minimizing any consideration for the women's physical or emotional well-being. Refusal was not an option, and even the slightest hesitation resulted in beatings or worse punishments. Evenings offered no respite from the horror. The women were confined to their quarters, doors locked from the outside, windows barred. The sounds of weeping and whispered prayers filled the air as they tried to process the day's trauma. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares and the constant fear of what tomorrow would bring. Once each week, the women were ordered to the communal bathing area, a large room with concrete floors and multiple shower heads. The weekly bath was presented as a health measure, but it served multiple purposes for their captors. The forced nudity eliminated any possibility of concealed weapons or escape tools. The communal nature prevented private conversations or planning. Most importantly, it reinforced their complete vulnerability and dependence on their captor's will. The bathing ritual followed a strict protocol. Guards positioned themselves at all entrances and exits while the women were ordered to undress completely. They were then herded into the bathing area like cattle, their bodies exposed to the leering gazes of soldiers who made no attempt to hide their predatory interest. The water was often cold, the soap harsh and insufficient, but complaints were met with immediate punishment. During these baths, additional medical inspections were conducted. Military doctors examined the women for signs of disease, pregnancy, or injury, their clinical detachment somehow more disturbing than outright cruelty. Those found to be ill or pregnant often disappeared, their fate unknown but easily imagined. The healthy were returned to their quarters to continue their forced servitude. Rae-Sun learned to dissociate during these weekly ordeals, focusing her mind on memories of her family's rice shop and the sound of her mother's lullabies. Liwi developed a technique of mental mathematics, calculating complex equations to keep her mind occupied, while her body endured the humiliation. Maria recited silent prayers, clinging to her faith despite the evil that surrounded her. The psychological toll was immense and carefully calculated. The comfort station system was designed not just to provide sexual services to soldiers, but to completely break the spirits of the women trapped within it. Every aspect of their daily existence reinforced their powerlessness and isolation. Letters home were forbidden, contact with the outside world eliminated, and any sense of hope systematically crushed. As 1944 progressed into 1945, subtle changes began to affect the routine of the comfort stations. The steady stream of soldiers became more erratic, with some days bringing crowds of men and others seeing only a handful of visitors. Supply deliveries became irregular, and the quality of food declined noticeably. The guards seemed more nervous, their conversations filled with hushed urgency. Distant sounds of artillery began to punctuate the days and nights. At first, the explosions were so far away they could barely be heard, but gradually they grew closer and more frequent. The women noticed that their captors spent increasing amounts of time scanning the horizon and monitoring radio communications. Something was changing, though none dared to hope it might mean their salvation. The guards' behavior became increasingly erratic as the sounds of battle drew nearer. Orders were given with more urgency, punishments became more severe for minor infractions, and the general atmosphere grew tense with barely contained panic. The women learned to read these signs, understanding that their captors' fear might create opportunities for survival, even if escape remained impossible. By early 1945, the systematic operation of the comfort stations began to break down. Medical inspections became less frequent, the weekly baths were sometimes skipped, and the rigid schedule that had governed their lives for months started to crumble. The women whispered among themselves during brief moments when guards were distracted, sharing observations and theories about what the changes might mean. Rae-Sun noticed that several guards had disappeared over the past weeks, their posts left unmanned or filled by increasingly young and nervous replacements. Liwi observed that supply trucks arrived less frequently and carried fewer provisions each time. Maria saw that the officers spent more time in heated discussions and less time supervising the daily operations of the station. The sounds of warfare continued to grow closer, and occasionally the women could see flashes of light on the horizon during the darkest hours of night. The explosions were no longer distant rumbles but sharp cracks that made the buildings shake and caused dust to fall from the ceiling. Yet none of the women dared to speak openly of hope, knowing that disappointment could be more crushing than the despair they had learned to endure. March 15, 1945 began like any other day in the comfort station, but the tension in the air was palpable from the moment of morning roll call. The guards were visibly agitated, speaking in rapid, hushed tones and constantly checking their weapons. The usual medical inspection was canceled without explanation, and the women were ordered to remain in their quarters longer than usual. Throughout the morning, The sounds of artillery grew steadily louder and more frequent. The building shook with each nearby explosion, and the women could hear vehicles moving rapidly outside their barred windows. Shouted orders in Japanese echoed through the corridors, but the tone was different from the usual commands. These voices carried urgency and fear rather than authority and control. By midday, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The normal routine had been completely abandoned, and guards ran back and forth through the facility carrying equipment and documents. The women huddled in their quarters, uncertain whether the chaos meant salvation or simply a different form of destruction. Late in the afternoon, despite the obvious crisis unfolding around them, the women received an unexpected order. They were to report immediately to the communal bathing area for their weekly wash. The timing seemed bizarre given the circumstances, but none dared to question the command. They had learned that disobedience brought swift and severe punishment, regardless of how illogical the orders might seem. As the women made their way to the bathing area, they noticed that many of the guard posts were empty or manned by soldiers who seemed barely old enough to hold weapons. The usual complement of officers was nowhere to be seen, and the few guards present appeared distracted and nervous. The sounds of battle were now close enough that individual explosions could be distinguished from the general rumble of warfare. The bathing area felt different that day. The guards who supervised the weekly ritual seemed rushed and inattentive, more concerned with whatever was happening outside than with maintaining their usual strict surveillance. The women undressed as commanded, but the atmosphere lacked the oppressive weight of absolute control that had characterized every previous bath. Rae-Sun noticed that one of the guards kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive. Li Wei observed that the usual medical personnel were absent, leaving only a handful of nervous soldiers to oversee the proceedings. Maria saw that weapons had been carelessly propped against walls rather than held at ready positions, suggesting that the guards' attention was focused elsewhere. As the women entered the communal shower area, the building shook with a particularly violent explosion that was clearly much closer than any previous blast. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several of the guards instinctively ducked or reached for their weapons. The sounds of battle were now so close that individual voices could sometimes be heard shouting in languages other than Japanese. The water was colder than usual, and the soap supply had dwindled to almost nothing, but the women went through the motions of bathing as they had been trained to do. The guards maintained their positions, but seemed increasingly distracted by the chaos erupting around the facility. Radio chatter crackled from communication devices, though the women could not understand the rapid Japanese being spoken. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the building with such force that several windows shattered and the lights flickered. The guards shouted to each other in obvious panic, and one ran from the room entirely. The women instinctively huddled together, their nakedness making them feel even more vulnerable in the face of whatever catastrophe was unfolding outside. The sounds of gunfire joined the artillery bombardment, and it became clear that ground combat was taking place very near the comfort station. The remaining guards argued among themselves in heated whispers, gesturing toward the exits and checking their weapons repeatedly. The women could sense that their captors were preparing to flee, but what that might mean for the prisoners remained terrifyingly unclear. Without warning, the main door to the bathing area burst open with tremendous force. Instead of the familiar uniforms of Japanese soldiers, the women saw men in different clothing carrying weapons they did not recognize. The newcomers moved with military precision, but their expressions showed shock and compassion, rather than the cold authority the women had learned to fear. The American soldiers who entered the bathing area stopped abruptly when they saw the scene before them. Dozens of naked, terrified women cowered against the walls, their bodies bearing the marks of months or years of abuse. The contrast between the soldiers' expectations and the reality they encountered was evident in their faces, which showed a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination. One of the American soldiers, a young sergeant with kind eyes, immediately began shouting orders to his men. Within moments, soldiers were removing their own jackets and shirts to provide covering for the women. Others positioned themselves to block the doorway and provide privacy, while their comrades worked to clothe the victims they had discovered. The language barrier created initial confusion, but the Americans' intentions quickly became clear through their actions. They offered water, food, and medical attention, while maintaining respectful distance, and averting their eyes whenever possible. The contrast with their previous captors could not have been more stark or more welcome. Rae-Sun found herself wrapped in a warm military jacket that smelled of soap and tobacco rather than fear and violence. The soldier who had given it to her spoke gently in English, his tone conveying safety and protection, even though she could not understand his words. For the first time in over a year, she felt the possibility that her nightmare might actually be ending. Li Wei accepted a canteen of clean water from an American medic, who examined her injuries with professional concern rather than clinical detachment. His touch was gentle and respectful, seeking only to assess her medical needs rather than to cause further harm. The simple act of being treated as a human being rather than property brought tears to her eyes. Maria clutched a blanket provided by a soldier who reminded her of her younger brother back in Manila. When he saw her tears, he offered a handkerchief and spoke softly in what sounded like Spanish, perhaps trying to find a common language. His efforts to communicate comfort and safety transcended the barriers of language and culture. The American soldiers worked efficiently to secure the area and provide immediate care for the women they had liberated. Medical personnel arrived quickly to assess injuries and provide treatment, while other soldiers documented the scene and gathered evidence of the atrocities that had been committed. The women were given clothing, food, and basic medical attention while arrangements were made for their protection and eventual repatriation. The liberation of the comfort station was part of a larger Allied advance that had finally reached this remote outpost of the Japanese Empire. The soldiers who discovered the women were part of a reconnaissance unit that had expected to find abandoned military facilities, not a functioning system of sexual slavery. Their shock at the discovery was genuine, and their determination to help the victims was immediate and unwavering. Over the following days, the women began the long process of recovery and repatriation. Interpreters were brought in to facilitate communication, and detailed testimonies were recorded for use in future war crimes proceedings. The physical wounds began to heal with proper medical care, but the psychological scars would take much longer to address. Many of the women struggled with the concept of freedom after so many months of absolute control. Simple choices like what to eat or when to sleep became overwhelming after extended periods of having every decision made for them. The American personnel assigned to their care showed remarkable patience and understanding as the women slowly began to reclaim their autonomy. The process of returning home proved complicated for many reasons. Some women had been taken so far from their original homes that transportation was difficult to arrange. Others feared the shame and stigma they might face in communities that might not understand what they had endured. A few had no homes to return to, their families having been killed or displaced by the war. Rae-Sun eventually made it back to Seoul, where she found her family's rice shop had been destroyed in bombing raids. Her parents had survived but aged dramatically during her absence, and her younger siblings barely remembered her. The reunion was joyful but complicated by the trauma she carried and the changes that war had brought to everyone's lives. Li Wei returned to Nanjing to discover that her family's restaurant had been converted into a military supply depot. Her parents had died during a particularly harsh winter, and she had no immediate family remaining. She eventually found work with an American relief organization, using her experience to help other victims of the war rebuild their lives. Maria's journey back to Manila was delayed by continued fighting in the Philippines, but she eventually reunited with her mother, who had never stopped praying for her daughter's safe return. The strong faith that had sustained Maria through her captivity became the foundation for her recovery, though she never spoke publicly about her experiences until decades later. The comfort station system represented one of the most systematic and widespread examples of sexual slavery in modern history. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were forced into sexual servitude by the Japanese military during World War II. The vast majority were Korean, but significant numbers came from China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied territories. The women who survived their captivity faced decades of silence and shame. Many never spoke of their experiences, even to family members, due to the stigma associated with sexual violence in their cultures. It was not until the 1990s that survivors began to speak publicly about their ordeals, demanding recognition and reparations from the Japanese government. The testimonies of comfort women survivors have provided crucial historical documentation of wartime sexual violence and its long-term effects on victims. Their courage in speaking out has contributed to international efforts to prevent similar atrocities and to provide justice for victims of sexual violence in conflict situations. The liberation of comfort stations by Allied forces was documented in multiple locations throughout the Pacific Theater. American, British, Australian, and other Allied soldiers discovered these facilities as they advanced through Japanese-occupied territory, and their reports provided some of the first evidence of the systematic nature of the comfort woman system. The moment of liberation, when doors that had been locked for months or years were finally opened by friendly forces, remained a defining memory for many survivors. The contrast between the cruelty of their captors and the compassion of their liberators provided a powerful symbol of hope and humanity in the midst of war's darkest chapters. For the American soldiers who discovered these facilities, the experience was equally transformative. Many had heard rumors of Japanese atrocities, but seeing the evidence firsthand reinforced their understanding of what they were fighting against and why their mission was so important. The care they provided to liberated comfort women became a source of pride that many carried for the rest of their lives. The legacy of the comfort women extends far beyond the immediate victims and their liberators. Their stories have become symbols of resilience in the face of systematic oppression and the importance of speaking truth about historical atrocities. The ongoing efforts to secure recognition and reparations continue to influence international discussions about justice for victims of wartime sexual violence. Today, memorials to comfort women stand in cities around the world, serving as reminders of both the atrocities committed and the strength of those who survived them. The simple bronze statues of young women sitting on benches or standing in quiet dignity represent not just the victims of one particular conflict, but all those who have suffered sexual violence in war and continue to seek justice and recognition. The bathhouse where Rae-Sun, Lee Wei, and Maria experienced their liberation no longer exists, but the memory of that moment when hope replaced despair continues to resonate. For these women and thousands like them, the day when Allied soldiers opened the doors of their prison marked not just the end of their captivity, but the beginning of a lifelong journey toward healing and justice. The courage required to survive such systematic brutality and then to speak publicly about those experiences, decades later demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The comfort women who broke their silence in the 1990s did so not for personal gain, but to ensure that history would remember their suffering and work to prevent similar atrocities in the future. Their voices, once silenced by shame and fear, have become powerful instruments of education and advocacy. The weekly demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, the testimonies before international tribunals, and the quiet conversations with family members all contribute to a growing understanding of wartime sexual violence and its lasting effects. The liberation of comfort stations represents more than just military victory over an enemy force. It symbolizes the triumph of human dignity over systematic dehumanization, of compassion over cruelty, and of truth over propaganda. The soldiers who opened those doors and the women who walked through them into freedom both played crucial roles in that larger victory. If you found this historical account moving and educational, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated with more untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered and shared. If you're already part of our community, please give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who need to hear these important stories. Your like helps ensure that the voices of survivors like Park Rae-Sun, Lee Wei, and Maria Santos continue to be heard and their experiences never forgotten. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your reflections on this story, discuss what you learned, or let us know about other historical events you'd like us to cover. Your engagement helps build a community dedicated to preserving and understanding our shared history. Remember, by subscribing, liking, and commenting, you're not just supporting our channel, you're helping to ensure that these crucial stories of human resilience and the fight for justice continue to reach new audiences around the world. Thank you for being part of this important conversation about history, memory, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and justice.